Hi, I'm Henry Coleman, and today is March 30th, 2000, and we're here in Beverly Hills, California, to interview Sidney Sheldon. Well, Sidney, we want to thank you for this opportunity to come to your beautiful home and interview you.
It's my pleasure. I think it's important.
It is very important, and what we want to do is just cover your early years, like where were you born?
The answer to that is Chicago.
Chicago. What was your name at birth?
Sidney Sheldon,
What date were you born, Sidney?
February 11th, 1917.
And what was your father's name?
Otto,
And your mother?
Natalie.
Natalie. What did your father do?
He was a salesman.
And your mother, was she a housekeeper?
She was more than a housewife.
Yeah.
She worked because this was during the Depression when I was born and when I was growing up and going to school. So it was difficult to earn money. There were no jobs for anyone. So she worked as a cashier and a sales lady and did anything she could.
Did you have sisters and brothers?
I have one brother 8 years younger than I, named Richard.
What's his name?
Richard.
Richard, excuse me, yeah. And what kind of hobbies did you have growing up? What were you interested in?
Reading.
Reading, oh.
That's about all I did.
So you spent a lot of time at the library.
Yes, my father was upset because I wasn't out there playing baseball. I was inside reading, and he thought I would come to no good end. He may have been right.
Do you recall who some of your favorite authors were at that time?
Oh, sure. I loved Sinclair Lewis, Thomas Wolfe,
Did you read things like
Thurber.
Tom Swift? Did you read any of those kind of
Oh, when I
books?
was younger, I read
Yeah,
the Tom
you did.
Swift books, yes.
Mhm. And what kind of hobbies did you have growing up?
I can't think of a single hobby. I just was interested in reading, and then I began to write, doing bad imitations of books that I had read.
You wrote in the Hemingway fashion, did you?
I don't know if it was the Hemingway fashion, but I would read magazines like Black Mask, which was a detective story magazine, and I would try to imitate those stories. I didn't try to imitate them, but I did imitate them.
What kind of student were you in school?
I was a good student, very bad in math, hopeless, and very good in English. They used to send me around to tell stories at the English classes. I remember one I told was the Cask of Amontillado by Poe, if I remember. And I would go around to all the different English classes and tell that story.
Acting all the parts.
Right.
Did you know then what you wanted to do when you grew up?
I always knew I wanted to be a writer. When I was about 10 years old, I wrote a poem and asked my father to send it into a magazine I read, a children's magazine called Wee Wisdom. And he said he would do it. But he didn't want to be embarrassed when they turned it down, so he took my name off and put my uncle's name on. And a few weeks later, he was having lunch with my uncle, and my uncle said, "Why would Wee Wisdom send me a check for $5? So I sold my first poem under my uncle's name.
That's wonderful. How was your family affected by the Great Depression? You already mentioned that your mother had to work, as well as your father, of course. In what circumstances were you living in at that time?
In one sense, hand to mouth, but in another sense, my father managed to find deals that would pay him perhaps $1,000 a week. And we would move from a little apartment to a lavish apartment. And then when the job ran out, we'd be back to a little apartment again. So it was a very strange kind of financial arrangement that I lived through.
Did that mean you were in different schools, too? Did you have to change schools?
I went to about 8 schools.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we were moving all the time.
What high school did you go to?
I was graduated from East High in Denver. I went to Sen High in Chicago, and a few schools in between.
And then you went to college after that.
I had 6 months. I got a scholarship to Northwestern. And after 6 months, I had to quit and go to work to help the family. And then later, I went to the McKinlock campus to study advertising for 6 months. So I had a total of about a year in college.
Did you ever regret that you didn't finish it?
Not really. I got into working right away.
Well, you got an education by your own hand.
Exactly.
When was the first time you saw television? Do you remember? Did you go to the World's Fair perhaps in 1939 in Chicago? Or 1939 was New York, right?
No, I think 39 was Chicago, either 36 or 39.
No, to keep it accurate here, 33 was Chicago.
33 was Chicago.
Yeah, and 39 was New York.
I was at the Chicago Fair, hanging hats and coats. I was working, and I worked at hotels in the evening, hanging hats and coats. That was a major job for me for a long time, and I did that while I was going to school. I would work evenings.
Do you remember any of the exhibits that was most impressive to you? Did you?
Any of the what?
Of the exhibits there that were most impressive to you?
The only exhibits I saw were men handing me their coats to put on hangers.
I see. Okay. So you never got to see television at the New York World's Fair?
Never got to see anything.
Okay. Do you recall when you first saw television?
No, I imagine it was in a living room in a small set, but I don't remember it.
As recent as the Milton Berle days and watching him on TV
Oh, I watched
nights?
Milton, sure.
Yeah. Do you remember what your first impressions were of television? Did you have any impression?
I thought it was fascinating, very entertaining.
Did you think about maybe going into it at some point?
Never.
Okay. I want to talk about your early times right from Northwestern. Did you come to California from there?
No, what happened was I was working at the Bismarck Hotel in Chicago, hanging hats and coats. And I wrote a song called My Silent Self, words and music. And I showed it to our orchestra leader at the hotel, Phil Levant. Those were the days of big orchestras before television, and they would play coast to coast. Phil said he would look at it, and he came back to me and said, I like it. I'd like to make an orchestration and play it. And I was thrilled. So from that time, every night, I would be hanging hats and coats and hear my song being played from around the corner in the big ballroom. And I quite naturally decided that I was Irving Berlin. So I wrote 12 more songs, told my parents I'd like to go to New York and be a songwriter. So they gave me permission. I took a Greyhound bus. I checked in at the YMCA in New York and they helped me get a job as an usher at the RKO Jefferson Theater, which was on 14th Street.
And how did you get your songs exposed to the music industry? What did you do?
I went uptown to the Brill Building, which is about 45 blocks away, every day after work. And sometimes I would have a dime, and I could afford I would have a hot dog and a drink, and I would be able to, I'd walk uptown. Other times, I would just have a hot dog, and instead of the drink for a nickel, I would take that nickel and use the subway and ride up. I would alternate.
And were you successful in selling those songs?
No, there was always one question. What have you had published? And that's called Catch-22. I said, nothing. And they said, come back when you've had something published.
Even in those days, right?
Even in those days. And finally, just as I think I was getting started, because a man named Max Rich took a liking to me, and we started writing songs. Now, Max Rich had two big hits. One was Smile Down Your Smile, and the other was The Girl in the Little Green Hat, based on an Harold Arlen, an Arlen novel, not Harold Arlen, but an Arlen novel. And it was at that time that I was seeing all these movies every day at the theater where I worked. And I saw all that glamour with Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby and Judy Garland and all these lavish backgrounds and beautiful apartments and homes. And I decided that that's where I wanted to be, not in New York. So I quit and went back to Chicago and asked for permission to go to Hollywood. And my mother gave me 6 weeks to find a job or come back home to Chicago. And I went to Hollywood, and I figured it was going to be pretty easy. And I went to the studios, and I said, "My name is Sidney Sheldon." I changed it by then. And I said, "I want to be a writer. Who do I see?" And the guards outside the studio gates all said the same thing. "You don't see anybody." And my time was running out. And one night, fortuitously, I heard about readers, people who synopsize stories for busy producers. And I had just finished reading Of Mice and Men, the wonderful Steinbeck book. So I sat down and wrote a synopsis, sent a copy to, there were then 8 major studios, sent it to each studio. Within 2 days, I'd heard from every one of them except Selznick. And they were all interested. They said when there was an opening, they would call me. The next day, I got a call from the Selznick studio asking me if I could write a synopsis and turn it in that evening. And I said, of course. What this involved was getting on a streetcar, riding toward Culver City, getting on a bus, going to the Selznick studios. This took most of the morning. And when I got there, they handed me a book to synopsize. And fortunately, I had met a young lady who was a secretary at MGM, which was just 2 blocks from the Selznick studio. So I ran over there with a book. It was around noon. And I asked her if she would skip her lunch and type up the synopsis, which wasn't written yet. She said yes. So I dictated the synopsis of the book to the typewriter as I read it. I managed to finish it by 6 o'clock, took the pages she had typed, ran to Selznick, turned it in just in time, and for that I got $3.
That's a momentous job to have done all that in one day, but it kind of set the pace for you of what your style was in recent years, later years, in terms of your own writing. I mean, you write as fast as you synopsize that.
Yes,
story.
I do.
I think that's a fascinating story. I just want to ask, do you recall what that book was by any chance?
No.
Okay, it's not necessary, but I just...
No.
So you worked at Selznick as a scriptwriter?
I remember one book I read. No, I didn't.
Oh,
that was just what they call an outside job.
I see.
No, the first job I got was at Universal Studios, run by a man called Papa Lemley.
Oh, yes.
It was a very small studio. And when they hired me, I got $17 a week. I walked into those stages, and it was like magic. I had never been in a studio before. And I knew that's what I wanted. I was just thrilled. And the one book I remember reading there was Meet John Doe. I read it, and my comment was that it was really 2 different stories. One was a comedy, one was a tragedy, and it wouldn't go together. And then to my horror, I read that someone had bought it, and I think Gary Cooper was the lead in it, and I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. But it came, it passed, and I was still doing reading.
And you read for 20th, too, didn't you, for 20th Century?
Yeah, what happened was someone bought Universal from Papa Lemley. And as is customary in Hollywood, the minute it changed hands, everybody at the studio was fired, and all the new people came in. Well, I'm a $17 a week writer, but they still fired me. So Fox was interested in me, and I went over there and became a reader. And the readers there were about 15 readers. And they told me that it was a long haul and not to expect anything. About a month later, I got a raise. And a month later, I got a second raise. And then they asked me to read books just for Zanuck, books he was interested in buying right away. So I got another raise. And I later learned that all the readers there were relatives of somebody at the studio. They weren't really professional readers.
Terrific. Well, how did you make the transition into writing screenplays? Like, where did you get the idea for your first screenplay?
I worked with a boy my age. We were then, I think I was 17 or 18. Ben was 19, Ben Roberts. I met him. He was an aspiring writer. The only thing he'd ever written was a Leon Errol short, and I hadn't written anything.
But you had met him in New York in theater.
No, I met him here.
Oh, you met him here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Later, we worked in the theater, but
Right.
in the beginning, we worked in Hollywood. We wrote 5 original stories. I would get up at 4 or 5 in the morning and work on stories, and Ben would work on it. We'd collaborate. None of them sold. Finally, one day, Ben came to me, and he said he had talked to a producer named Ted Richmond, who later became a partner of Tyrone Power in making movies. But at that time, Ted worked for a company called Producing Releasing Corporation, PRC. He asked me, he said Ted was interested in the story we had just written, and he asked me to meet with him and talk to him about it. It was called South of Panama. So I met with Ted, and he said, yeah, we want to buy it. We'll give you $750. That's for the original story, and you have to write a screenplay. So I said, that's great. I said, would you give us $800 because we divide the money, then we can divide it evenly? And he said, no. So I went back to Ben, and I said, I think we have a deal. And there was an agent named Ray Crossett, who was the story editor for the Leland Haywood Agency, probably the biggest agency in Hollywood. I mean, they handled everyone from Garbo to Gable. And I said to Ray Crossett, we've just sold our first story. He said, who'd you sell it to? And I said, PRC. And this man, who was with the biggest agent in town, said, what is PRC? He had never even heard of it. That's how small it was. Way below Monogram and Republic. So I told him what the deal was. He said, well, have you finalized your deal? Because I'd like to sell it elsewhere. And I said, you can't do that. I'd have to ask Ted first because, I really feel an obligation to him. So he said, well, call Ted and tell him you want to get out of the deal. So I called Ted. He was busy cutting a Henry Arbetta movie. Didn't call me back. I called him all afternoon. Finally, at 5 o'clock, I called Ray Crossett, and I said, Ray, I can't reach him, and we don't really have a deal because I'm asking for $800. He's offering $750. And he said, don't worry about it. I sold it to Paramount 2 hours ago. You got $1,000, and you don't have to do the screenplay. I said, oh, we want to do the screenplay. He said, no, you don't understand. They don't want you to do the screenplay. That was our first. I felt guilty because I'd sold this from under Ted's nose. So I called him at home that night. And because I felt defensive, I went on the attack. I said, Ted, you almost cost us a sale. I tried to get you all, and I have him apologizing. I said, but you're in luck. Ben and I have a story that's even better that we'll give you. And he said, great, meet me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at the Pig and Whistle with the executive producer. And I hung up and turned to Ben and said, we have to think of a story. We had nothing. So we sat down and created a story. We worked until 5 in the morning. I typed it up, and I got up at 7 to read it. And you wouldn't think you could write a decent story under those circumstances. You'd be right. It was terrible. But I had no choice. I took it to Pig and Whistle, met with them, kind of hid my head while they read. Each had a copy. And they both finished at the same time and said, wonderful, and they bought it. So Ben and I sold 2 stories within 12 hours.
That's a great story. And did you continue to write with Ben then at that point?
Oh, yes, we wrote other stories. We worked for Republic, and I asked for a raise there. And not only did they say no, we didn't work again for a year, and the raise was $50. But we managed to write other stories, and then the war came along. Ben was enlisted, and I wanted to be in the Air Force. So I got in the Air Force, and I finished my training at Richfield, Utah, in primary engines.
Quite a change from Los Angeles, California.
Yeah, single-engine planes, and Ben, meanwhile, was in a training unit back east. And when I finished, I was waiting for a secondary school with multi-engines, and I wore glasses, so I couldn't fly combat. I could only do air training command or transport. So I went to New York to wait for the next school to open up. And while I was there, my agent, then the Louis Scher office, said there was a couple, Jan Kapura and Marta Eggerth, who were famous European stars, want to do a new book for The Merry Widow. They're looking for a writer. Do you want to talk to them? I didn't know anything about Broadway plays. I said, sure. I talked to them, told them what I had in mind, and they said, you're hired. And I said, wait a minute, I want to work with Ben Roberts. I was terrified. So I called Ben and said, will you write this with me? And he said, yeah. So we're both in the Army. I'm in the Air Corps. He's in the Army.
Was he stationed in the New York area?
He was stationed in the New York area. Uh-huh. So he would come to the hotel, and we worked on The Merry Widow. The producer was it was the New Opera Company, and that was the name of the company, and her name was Mero Yolanda Marion. And she was kind of a snobbish society lady. And all she kept saying as our book came along was, it's terrible, it's terrible. Well, we opened at the Majestic Theater, one of the largest theaters in New York. George Balanchine was our choreographer. Our musical director was very well known. Not to me at this moment, obviously.
Lehman Engel or someone like that.
What?
Someone like Lehman Engel.
Yeah, even more famous than that. He had written popular songs. He was very famous. And the play ran for a year and a half on Broadway. It was a smash, beautifully done. While we were in rehearsal, George Balanchine came to me and said, you know, I like your work so much. A friend of mine is producing a play. I'd like to introduce you to him. So he took me over to Vinton Friedley, who was producing another show called Jackpot with Ellen Jones, Nanette Fabry, Betty Baker. And they hired me to write Jackpot. So I said, I want Ben to write this with me. So Ben and I wrote Jackpot. While Jackpot was in rehearsal and The Merry Widow was in rehearsal, someone took me over to another producer named Richard Colmar, who was married to Dorothy Kilgallen. They were doing a show called Dream with Music. And they said, we'd like you to. I said, yeah, I'm doing it with Ben Roberts. So I was about 25 and had 3 Broadway shows running simultaneously.
Fantastic. You were also, it was fortuitous that the Army didn't want to transfer you out of New York to some godforsaken place apart from Ben Roberts.
Yeah, no, they were waiting to put me in secondary aviation.
Uh-huh. And you got to work together that whole time.
Yeah.
What did you do after you were discharged from the Army?
When I was discharged, I was in New York, and I didn't want to go. I'd been at Hollywood offers, which I wasn't interested in before, but now I did not want to go to Hollywood with nothing, looking for a job. I wanted to have material, because material is always king. So I didn't have an idea. So I sat down in the middle of my living room in a chair in the middle, and I said, I'm not getting up until I have an idea. And I sat there for 2 hours, just concentrating. And finally, I got an idea, and I got up and did what I had to do. And I wrote the idea. It was called Suddenly It's Spring. Took it to Hollywood, and an agent there sold it to David Selznick. And Dory Sherry produced it. And one day Selznick, I wrote the screenplay, and Selznick called me and said, we're changing the title of your picture. And I said, yes, what is that? And he said, we're calling it The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer. And I said, Mr. Selznick, sir, nobody in the world is going to pay to go see a movie called The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer, because I happen to know much more about the business than he did. So it opened at Radio City Music Hall, broke all the records. I got an Oscar for it. That was the beginning.
It shows that even in those days, people in Hollywood didn't know what would make a hit, right?
You never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah. So having gotten that Oscar, did that open up the way for you then in Hollywood?
Yes, what was happening was the studio, MGM, wanted me to write a picture called Pride and Prejudice. And they were arguing about a half a dozen really minor points with my agent. Time, money, nothing that was totally major. The day after I got the Oscar, they called my agent in and said, "You've got all the points, just sign here." So I was on a 6 months option contract to MGM as a writer. And the writers there were 35 writers. And they told me that nothing much would happen. If I did a picture every 2 years, the studio would be happy. That was about the average. And as it turned out, when I started to do Pride and Prejudice, Arthur Freed called me in and said, I'm doing a story called Annie Get Your Gun, and I'd like you to work on that. So I said, fine. Now, in Annie Get Your Gun, there's a big dichotomy. Act 1 ends in America. Act 2 goes to Europe and comes to America. And the question is, and it's a producer's decision, how much of Europe do you want to show in the movie? Because that's expensive. You want to do a montage? You want to do a whole European sequence? Or just briefly go by it? Well, I couldn't make this decision, so I sat there. I called Arthur Freed's office. I said, I want to meet with Mr. Freed. I had an appointment. And the day of the appointment, his secretary called and said he couldn't meet with me. Had to appoint the next day. Next day, called and said he couldn't meet with me. This went on for 3 or 4 days. And one day, my agent came into the office and said, Arthur Freed is very disappointed in you. And I said, why? And he said, he's not getting any pages. And I suddenly realized he didn't want to talk about the script. He was interested in the musical part of it, the dancers, the songs, not the story. So I sat down and belted out the story of Annie Get Your Gun.
And you made that decision on your own about Europe? Or
Absolutely.
what did you decide to do?
I showed part of it, a good part of it. Uh-huh. And then we went over it later with the director, and it worked out fine. Then I started doing a lot of movies. I ended at MGM 12 years later as a writer, producer, director.
Were you working alone, or did you collaborate during?
No, I worked alone.
You did.
Yeah.
We're going to change tapes right now,
Fine.
so we'll come back to that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.